you probably came to this talk expecting to hear from Michael Stokesbury, and you'll note that most of us affectionately just refer to him as Stokes. So that's just sort of been a nickname. And I know that with us teaching together at Eastern Washington University, that's always been a fun point of confusion of people saying, where's Michael? It's like, right, he's right there. That's Stokes. But I can assure you that you guys are in for a treat. He is a wonderful speaker. I always find something interesting and new to learn from him. And he's usually one of the ones that likes to go off and try things that I would never have thought of. So with that, Stokes, it's all you, buddy. Take it away.
Gee, thanks. Yeah, I'll pay you later for that intro. That was way better than that was way nicer than I was expecting of you. So thanks.
No problem. That'll be double.
Right. So yeah, I guess, can people see my screen? Which should be a Scott Hanselman blog post.
We did, and then it vanished.
Awesome. You know what I've got? I'm sharing.
Sorry, that may have been me killing the spotlight. I may have hijacked.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing and I'll share again. Okay, I want that one. Okay. How about now?
Good to go.
Good to me.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, I guess we saw already the title screen was basically dev containers and then deploying out to Raspberry Pis. And kind of where I'm going with this right now is originally, so I went out and bought a whole bunch of Raspberry Pis after reading this Kubernetes post that Scott Hanselman had, thinking, hey, you know what, that looks like it'd be a fun project. And I was all for it. I thought, let's go for it and see what happens. And then I made the mistake of heading down to my parents' house for spring break, or not spring break, but for a winter break. And all of a sudden, my dad then sat there and said, hey, you know what? I want to do some stuff with Python. And I'm like, okay, I don't have a Python machine set up. So I'm not sure. Let's learn that one. And then he's like, okay, and I've got a whole bunch of Raspberry Pis that I think I'd just like to try to make servers with. So instead of actually getting a Raspberry Pi Kubernetes cluster, my setup looks similar to this. So my setup that we're going to actually be goofing around with today looks a lot like this. This is mine. It's got the Wi-Fi router on top. So all of my Pi devices are actually connected with a Wi-Fi router. My dad sat there and said, hey, rumor has it, you can actually, instead of using the SD cards on these Raspberry Pis, you can hook up a USB drive and actually have an SSD. So this piece down here at the bottom is actually a solid state drive that is powering my bottom Raspberry Pi, or that's my drive instead of a standard SD card on my Raspberry Pi. That's my hard drive right there. I actually, in order of appearance here, we basically have I've got my Pi-hole, so I've got my DNS server sitting up top here. I've got a web application or web server as my second stack. I've got an API server for my third stack. My fourth stack is actually what I would refer to as my auth server. So I kind of decided, hey, you know what, I want to, instead of doing a Kubernetes cluster, I want to do kind of a multi-server type of setup. And then this bottom one, believe it or not, is, since it's got the actual SSD drive, this bottom one's actually running SQL Server, not Postgres, not MySQL. They actually do have a version of SQL Server. Azure Edge, I believe, was the version that they've got that runs inside of Docker and can run on a Raspberry Pi. It can run on an ARM64 based operating system. So this last guy is actually a SQL Server database that's sitting there and running off of a Raspberry Pi. These are all Pi 4s, 4 gigs of RAM, I believe, is what I ended up buying. Ended up picking them up at, well, sorry, this top one's only a 2 gig, and then all these other guys are 4 gigs. And so this talk kind of decided it was going to be you know what, let's just see what we can do with Raspberry Pis. And then as I was messing around and I kind of was goofing around with my dad, who's also a computer science guy, and like I said, I had no experience with Python or anything like that, except for a little bit that I did actually with Steve way back when. I didn't have a good dev environment. And so I sat there and I was like, okay, I need to get Python configured. And I'm like, hey, I read this thing called dev containers. Let's take a look at that and see what that will do for us. And so my dad and I that's how exciting my Christmas break was. My dad and I over Christmas break started looking at dev containers because he wanted to be able to get his machine set up and then kept asking me questions on how to get his machine to work. And so instead of trying to troubleshoot his machine and my machine, we decided we were going to use dev containers. And that's kind of the joy of dev containers, right? I'm not sure if anyone's kind of goofed around with them before, but the nice thing about dev containers is they're actually virtual machines for the most part. So I don't know how many people in the past, in the past, when I used to work with a contract company or something like that, I used to sit there and have a virtual machine basically that I would spin up depending on which contract or which project I was actually working on even. It kind of got to the point where even when I was working, not even as a contractor, when I was working for a company out in the valley at one point in time, I was on 2 or 3 different projects. And so I just spun up a virtual machine per project, which that made it so, okay, nothing that I installed collided with anything else. And then when I found out about these dev containers, I'm like, hey, this is actually a real similar situation to what I was trying to do with virtual machines, but just in a smaller frame. So yeah, we're going to sit down and we're going to actually we're going to look at what dev containers are, is kind of where here's a roadmap of the talk. I'm going to take a look at what dev containers are. We're then going to actually, because you guys know me, if you've attended any of my talks, I do web stuff. So we're going to spin up a website in a dev container. We're going to create an ASP.NET Core website, real simple, kind of just a simple hello world thing. But throughout that process, we're going to see some of the quirks that you run into actually when you're trying to use dev containers and everything else. And then, yeah, by the end, what we should be able to do is take a application that we wrote inside of our dev container, package that up so we can actually deploy that out to a Raspberry Pi. And one piece to point out about these Raspberry Pis is I don't have .NET installed on any of these Raspberry Pis. I didn't want to do that. All the tutorials I found out there online were like, oh yeah, you just install .NET and then you copy stuff over and just click run. And I sat there and said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do it as self-contained. So we're actually going to be creating a Raspberry Pi or an ARM64 based self-contained deployable that we put out there, deployment that we put out there. So it's going to be completely packaged to where I didn't have to have .NET Core 5 or .NET Core 3.1 or anything like that. Or sorry, .NET 5. It's not .NET Core anymore, right? .NET 5 installed. I didn't have to have .NET Core 3.1 installed or anything like that. These are all self-hosted, self-contained. So I can run as many of these as I want to side by side. I guess the only other thing that I need to talk about probably on this setup before we really get started is we are also going to sit down and figure out how to do SSL. I've got Nginx actually running. I know I'm wiggling my mouse over here. I've got Nginx actually running on the Pi Web, my Pi Web server. And so we're actually going to have our .NET Core, or sorry, I keep calling it .NET. I wish they wouldn't have changed the name, because that just you had what, 4 years of calling it .NET Core, and now they're like, no, you can't call it that anymore. So we're going to have the new .NET actually running there, but we're going to front it so that we can actually hit it as a full-blown URL. Nginx is going to be the front server for it, so we can actually hit it from a DNS name, and then one .NET to rule them all, exactly, as long as you know what you're supposed to call that .NET version. Yeah. So we'll be hitting it via not through an IP address or anything like that. That was part of the DNS system that I've got set up here. Was I wanted to be able to make it basically set up a dev environment that was going to be very similar to my hosting provider that I use. So when I copy stuff out, this is kind of for everyone who's doing DevOps, right? This is my dev/test environment. In fact, the reason. And yes, I know I go down rabbit holes. You guys are going to put up with my rabbit holes because everyone has to when I give these talks. One of the big reasons why I actually fronted it with Nginx and then tried to figure out, and we will be tackling some SSL issues, is because I wanted to host all my stuff as .dev. That just made sense to me. This is my dev server. So I sat there and said, hey, let's have a .dev extension on my URL. Well, I don't know if anyone's been goofing around with Chrome and stuff like that, but a lot of these browsers now have certain domains that they sit there, not domains, but I guess it's the last part in a URL, which I can never remember exactly what it's called, but your .coms or your .nets. .dev, apparently, all browsers now have a rule that if you have your name that ends in .dev, it automatically forces HTTPS. You cannot make an HTTP call to a .dev domain. browser will automatically redirect you to HTTPS. And there's a couple of other ones. A company that I work for, that I'm doing some work for right now, they just got bit by that because the latest update to Chrome about 3 or 4 months ago sat there, and the URL that they were using for all of their dev environments, Chrome then sat there and said, nope, you know what, we're making this a HSTS rule, I think was what the big piece is that was killing them. And by the way, if I'm saying anything incorrectly here, people speak up if I'm using the wrong terms, because I'm all for getting the terms correct here. But I basically sat there and forced them to have to put SSL, put a cert on all of their websites if they wanted to keep the domain going that way. And it just, I mean, everyone broke. We were all sitting there. We came into work on Monday and no one could hit any of the development servers anymore because everything sat there and was forcing HTTPS instead of HTTP, and we didn't have the certs set up correctly. Jack, to answer your question, no, these are actually all running Ubuntu, I want to say 2010. So the October 2020 version of Ubuntu, 64-bit, not 32-bit, is what I've got on all of these Pis. So, and like I said, I've got Nginx on all of them except for this last one. This last one is just sitting there, and it's actually running Docker. I do have a Docker image that's then running the SQL Server instance for me. So you guys are going to actually see some of my pain points that I go through as a developer today too, because this machine that I'm actually on is a brand new machine. I got it just about a week ago, and sat there and said, hey, you know what? What better way to try to sit here and do a demo and show people this is how you can use a machine setup than to do it on a brand new machine. So we are going to, you're going to actually have to see some of the pain points that I actually have gone through in the past, and some of the solutions that we have for these pain points, so that if you are trying to do this for the first time, I won't have really any smoke and mirrors or anything like that. This is going to be let's get a dev container up and running. Let's figure out how to do local dev certs so we can run our stuff locally. And then let's sit there and figure out, okay, how do I get certs installed on my machine so that as I'm running on my Raspberry Pis, I can still actually hit it as HTTPS. So any questions on kind of what we're doing here? Okay, silence is golden. And yes, just an FYI, I am actually connected to this. Right now I am, this Wi-Fi router right now is the router I'm actually connected to and talking to, because that's all these Pis are listening to on. So I am truly using this. That little yellow cable that's coming out of the back is going into my main router that I usually connect to. So you guys are seeing everything that I'm doing here. I just decided to take a picture early instead of actually trying to turn around a webcam so you guys could see what all the blinky lights and everything else. Okay, so without further ado, let's get Visual Studio Code up and running. Empty Visual Studio Code, is that font big enough for everyone? Can people see? Do I need to go bigger? Okay, I'm going to assume silence is golden there too. Okay, so perfect. And if it looks good to Kevin, it looks good for everyone, because Kevin sets the bar for what's good. So no pressure, Kevin, on anything you have to talk about next time or anything like that. You just set the bar on what's good. Let's see. So let me start off. I'm actually going to cheat and come over here. And yeah, you guys are now going to see a ton of tabs, because everyone who's seen my talks in the past know that I love browsers and I know that I love tabs. So what is a dev container? And the reason why I'm bringing up this, so this is actually Visual Studio Code. They've got great documentation on getting started with dev containers and everything else. Oh, there we go. Yes. And how do I use it? Yeah. You get forced into using it, right, Sean? Yeah. Because I'm sure you felt that pain with the client as well. So what we end up running into, and like I said, they've got great documentation over here, but really what you end up doing here is on our local OS, we are going to have Visual Studio Code that's basically going to be our editor and everything else, and our source code is going to live on our local machine. But then we are going to kind of spin up a Docker container. Well, I say we're going to spin it up. It kind of gets spun up for us. And so then inside the Docker container, this is now where all of our workspace extensions, I don't even want to read off of this thing. It's basically, what's the programming language I'm going to be using? What are the VS Code extensions even that I'm going to be using? I do all my debugging. I do all my applications, my terminal and everything is running now inside this virtual container. So you will see here when I bring up and let me bring it over here, my command prompt. So inside my command prompt, and yeah, like I said, it's brand new, so I have not customized the POS shell or anything like that yet. But if I do .NET here, I don't have .NET running on my machine at all. I've got no instance of .NET. I can't do the .NET list SDKs or anything like that, right? I sat here and said, I don't want to have any .NET running on my machine. Everything I do is going to be inside of a dev container. So let's now jump over to VS Code and take a look at what we want to do here. So I guess actually instead of VS Code, I'm going to close that down. I'm going to come over here. I say over here, and you guys can't see over here because the screen is on over another spot. But I'm going to create a directory, and we're just going to call this a new folder. And we're going to say presentation. Actually, I should call this IntelliTech because this will eventually go into our IntelliTech samples repo. And let's create a new folder here. And I'm just going to call this user group. And the reason why I'm doing this is actually I want to open up this folder inside of VS Code. So I didn't have the folder created. I wanted to actually open up this folder in VS Code. And in order to do that, I needed to actually create the folder first. Well, I guess I probably could have tried to do it through their file explorer, but I didn't want to do that. So how do I get started with dev containers? Well, okay, I said no magic or anything like that. Let me step back. One thing I did set up before actually doing this user group was I did install Docker. So your prelims basically that you need, your prereqs that you basically need are, you want to have Docker. It's recommended. I don't know if it's required. I think so. The documentation was a little confusing on if it's truly required or not. Everyone seems to recommend though that you at least want to have WSDL 2 up and running for this. I mean, WSDL 2 or Windows Subsystem for Linux. I don't want to sit there and use an acronym. I hope everyone's kind of familiar with that. So you install Docker, and then Docker, instead of running in a virtual machine now, like they used to require, they still require Hyper-V and all that fun stuff. But instead of it actually spinning up a Hyper-V instance, it now actually will sit there and use your Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2, because I've been doing a lot of work there. That's now basically your engine for Docker. So instead of it being in, performance has gotten a lot better now that you can run it in WSDL 2 instead of actually through the Hyper-V, the true Hyper-V image. So I do have Docker installed. I do have it enabled for WSDL 2. And in fact, we can come in here and take a look. If I open up this guy, and I know I'm saying this guy and you guys can't see what this guy is, but I'm basically opening up my Docker settings, and I'll drag it now over here. And you will see that I've got Docker installed, my Docker instance is running, and I am using the WSDL 2 based engine. So I did actually have to get that up and running. That's the magic that I did before the user group, because I didn't think you guys wanted to sit there and see me watch me install Docker and reboot my machine 4 times, as you have to enable all the features in Windows so that you can actually run WSDL and everything else. So I saved the pain of having to reshare my screen every time I left here to reboot my machine for you guys. And so now that I've got that installed though, and I do have Visual Studio installed, Visual Studio Code. This is a plugin. As far as I know, dev containers do not work with Visual Studio. I don't know if it's on the roadmap. I haven't heard much about that. But you will notice I've got Visual Studio Code installed, and I do have a couple of extensions installed. So I did actually go out and install, the big one that you actually want to install is this remote development. So if you pick remote development, I'm going to close down recommended because I don't want you guys to even think I've got any other extensions installed. You can see these are the only extensions I currently have installed inside of Visual Studio Code. I always just install remote development, and by default then when you get remote development, it's basically a wrapper that installs remote WSDL, which allows you to connect to your, if you did just have Windows Subsystem for Linux running, you can actually use VS Code and punch a hole into there. You can do SSH, which I've actually used before, so I can develop directly on a Raspberry Pi. I have done that where I just connect to a Raspberry Pi via SSH, and I use Visual Studio Code as my File Explorer so that I can sit there and do everything I want to do over there. This is the one that we're actually using today, though. This is the remote container. So this is the extension. If you only installed one extension, this is the extension you'd actually want to install if you wanted to actually use dev containers. This is the big one that you need. I also then did install just the Docker extension. And so you can see, though, I don't have any Docker containers or no images up and running on this machine. So we are really starting from ground zero on this whole thing, minus some machine setup right off the bat. So let's get rolling. And inside of File Explorer here, I'm going to create a new file. And yes, I'm creating a new file. So there's two ways to basically tell VS Code that you're going to be using a dev container. I can create a directory called .dev container and put a dev container.json file in it, or I can just sit there and for right now, and we will get into that type of a setup, but for right now, just to go quick and dirty to give you guys an idea, I can also just create a standard dev container.json file. And inside of this, the easiest way, the most simple way to get up and running in order to get a actual instance running is I need to tell it of an image that I actually want to pull down. And since we want to sit there and goof around with Microsoft stuff, because I was told I wasn't allowed to goof around with other languages because this is a Microsoft.NET user group and not a other language user group. So we're going to stick with this. And sorry, I know. See, now I get to throw Erin under the bus since she's not on the recording anymore, but she'll hear it later, so it's okay. So we're going to sit there, and right now I am just going to pull down the 3.1. Yes, we're not going to stay in 3.1, but I am going to pull down a 3.1 image, and so that's all I've done, right? I've now sat there, I've created a dev container.json file, and I've said I want to use the Microsoft.NET SDK, and I'm specifically saying, whoops, I don't want to do that, and I'm specifically saying which version of the SDK that I want. So now I can come up into my tools and I can say reopen in container. And when I say reopen in container, Visual Studio Code is going to notice, oh, you have a dev container file. It's now going out and we should see, you can see right here, I'm starting dev container. I can show the log. So it's now sitting there and going out and actually pulling down the Docker SD, the .NET SDK 3.1 container, bringing it all down, and hopefully my internet stays up and decides it's going to go fairly quickly because usually they don't take too long to pull down. But now it looks like it's paused since I actually made that comment. But it gave me a chance to wet my whistle. And so what it's doing right now is it's pulling down that whole SDK instance, and ideally this is going to not lock up. Can people still hear me? Okay, good. I just saw Kevin's head move, so I know I haven't locked up my machine.
No, you are still in existence.
I am still in existence, but this looks off. There we go. Okay, good. It's just taking a little while longer to download than I was expecting. So I guess, I mean, I don't know how many people know how to use Teams or what capabilities you guys have, but by show of hands, if you guys can use your hands in this thing, have people messed around with Docker? I mean, I guess it's one of those where I know I'm throwing out some terms here, and we kind of said the talk was going to be on dev containers and everything else, but I guess I want to make sure people are kind of familiar with some of the other pieces I'm talking about too. Okay, so we've got a couple of people that are familiar with some of this stuff, which is good. For those of you that aren't, it's not necessarily integral to this because we are going to get a little bit into Docker files as we kind of get a more complicated piece, but oh my gosh, this is taking way longer than I thought, unless my refresh is just off. Let's resize that again and see if that changes. Yeah, look at that. When I resize the window, it goes much faster. So we will actually be getting into some of the more powerful capabilities right now. And this is kind of one of the things that's interesting is right now I'm specifically just pulling down an image, which means if I decide I want to make changes or anything like that, I don't have a Docker file per se that I own. Right? I mean, because that's one nice thing about Docker is you can build. So right now I wish I could actually get that file open, but because it's still trying to pull down stuff, I don't get my File Explorer open because I'm not running inside my container yet. So we downloaded a newer version. That's good. We're starting up the container. So what we're doing is we're using a prepackaged image, right? We're not making any modifications to this image or anything else. We're at the mercy of whatever Microsoft's image actually has. And so here we go. And so, like I said, so now there's my dev container.json. We pulled down that image. And now if I come here and I go into my terminal, let's open up another terminal. You'll notice it's a bash shell, right? I mean, I'm now inside of, so it's running Docker for Linux, right? I'm not running Docker. I'm running Docker for Windows, but then using the Docker Linux images. So I'm actually running Linux over here. So now I can do the ls. So I'm in an empty space. But now if I say .NET list SDKs, you can see I'm actually do have .NET Core. I'm allowed to call it .NET Core, I think, as long as it's pre-5, right? So I now have .NET Core 3.1 actually installed on this machine. And no, we're not going to do anything fancy with this or anything like that. It's basically just a matter of showing you, I went from not having .NET at all on my machine to now have, because remember, I had no .NET here on my actual machine. Now when I actually type list SDKs, I actually do have a 3.1. I can come over here and we're going, because we actually want to mess around with the 5.0 images. I can come over here and now I'm now changing my image, right? So I'm currently running in a Docker 3.1 instance. I've now just come in here and changed my dev container and wiped out the little token that says, hey, use 3.1. Yeah, so instead of using 3.1, I've now sat there and said, use your default, where their default is their latest released version. It's not their latest LTS or anything like that. It's not the long term. It's just the latest release. So by picking this one, I'm now sitting there and saying, okay, I want 5.0 at this point in time, but if for some reason 6.0 got released, like if 5.0 was released yesterday and I rebuild my image and 6.0 got released today, I would then be getting 6.0. And so you're always going to be getting the latest. And this is one thing that's really nice actually about dev containers. So little side tangent again, because I go down these tangents, right? Is one of the things that got me interested in dev containers is, again, another customer that I was working for, they sat there and they do a good job of kind of locking down the systems so that you can't really do a whole lot, but then they like to push a lot of updates to you. And we were doing some development that required a particular version of some tooling. And I guess the security team decided that that tooling was outdated and they needed to push newer version of the tooling. Well, their newer version of their tooling actually broke our development environment, where if we would have been in this dev container, we could have sat there and specified, hey, you know what, my dev container does need to stay on 3.3 or does need to stay on 2.2. I can now sit there and control my environment. It's not going to be set. It won't just be someone pushing updates to my computer that can technically break my development environment, because my development environment is not really in my computer anymore. It's living inside of this virtual machine. So if we do this, and now I can come back up here, and yeah, you guys can see, I actually did like practice the demo before this user group talk. So you will see I've got some recent commands in here that I've done before. But now now that we're currently inside a container, so before we sat there and said, hey, open this up, open my folder in a container. Now we want to change our container. We want to rebuild it because we made a change to the dev container.json file. So rebuilding this image, it's now going to go out and say, oh, you now have a .NET 5. You're now trying to get the latest version of .NET. So it's sitting there and going out, and we can show the log here again. But you'll see I'm now pulling down stuff again, right? If I would have left it, and you'll see it was unable to find this image locally on my machine. It could not find SDK latest, which happens to be SDK 5.0. Couldn't find that locally on my machine. So it's now going to go out and pull that down from the Docker repository so that I actually have access to it. So we will sit there and pull that down and let that download. And I did see a question come up. So yes, currently the images that I'm pulling down are actually Debian Ubuntu based. Microsoft actually does have a lot of different instances. And what I mean by that is if you come over here, if I look, so you can actually look and see the .NET SDKs. So right now, like I said, latest is the 5.0 or the current. We could have picked the 3.1 and about, but what you can actually do is you'll notice if you come down here, we could have gotten very specific on which one we wanted, right? I could have sat there and said, I don't actually want Buster, which happens to be the default that I think it's Buster. And I don't want to misspeak on those. So yeah, so it is. So when you just put in the 5.0 or you leave it blank so that you get the latest, you'll notice that all of these images are these are all the same tags. So if I would have put any of these at the end, like any of these past the colon, I would have actually, well, I shouldn't say any of these. Oh yeah, because this is AMD. So I would have gotten all of these are basically the exact same image. But you can see they actually do make a 502 for Alpine. They make a 502, and I can't remember what focal is. Alpine is like the slimmest or the smallest instance I think you can usually. Oh, I guess these are both. Oh, so there you go. So you've got an Alpine 3.2, an Alpine 3.13, or you've got focal, which is Ubuntu. So I guess I'm pulling down a Debian. I'm actually not pulling down an Ubuntu image because we're using just the latest, which happens to be Buster, which happens to be Debian. I could have sat there and I could have done colon 5.0 - focal, and I would have pulled it down on an Ubuntu based OS instead. So you can kind of, at least with the Microsoft tags, you can kind of pick your OS flavor or your Linux flavor as well. And the footprint on these Alpines are a lot smaller. Or I don't know, a lot smaller because I haven't really done the file comparisons. From what I've read, the Alpine footprints are smaller than the Debian or Ubuntu footprints. So I always just kind of go with the default and call it good. But yeah, so if you're ever curious to know exactly what images are out there, you can always go out to hub.docker.com. And then if you just look for Microsoft.NET SDK, you can actually type that up in the search up here, and that will take you to this same thing. You can actually see the images that you could pull down. So, and you can see this MCR Microsoft.com .NET SDK 5.0. That is exactly what we punched in here. MCR Microsoft.com .NET SDK. So, and it looks like we now have that. So if I then open up another command prompt here, I can do .NET list SDKs, and you'll see I'm now running 5.0.2, where before I was running the 3.1 instance. So again, I don't have, my local machine doesn't have anything. My Docker images now I can sit here and I can swap back and forth between, or I can swap back and forth, or I can have different dev containers to say, hey, I'm still working on a legacy application. I know it sounds weird to say legacy application and then say 3.1, since that is the long-term solution or the long-term supported one right now. But I'm working on a legacy app that needs 3.1, and I'm working on a new one. And yes, I know Microsoft sits there and says, hey, everything works side by side, hunky-dory, beautiful, and everything else. And I do. I trust Microsoft 99.99% of the time. If they ever watch this, I don't mind them knowing that that's about as much as I trust them. I have run into a couple of instances sometimes where it seems like one clobbers the other. I will admit with .NET Core and the new .NET, it hasn't happened as much as it did with the older versions of .NET, but or like the full framework versions of .NET. But I have still seen some interesting quirks sometimes with some of my tooling, especially around like EF Core when you're trying to do some of the database migrations. If you're still on a 2.2 instance and all of a sudden you're trying to do we ran into an issue, and I don't know if it was just individual's machine, but he had .NET 5 installed. He had .NET 5 installed, and we're still running in a 2.2 environment, and he tried to do some migrations, and it just kind of, it didn't work out too well when we were actually trying to sync things up. So So question was, does the Linux distro I choose need to line up with my Docker image, match what my WSDL distro is? I actually do not have a WSDL distro installed on this machine. Like if I come up here, if I hit this guy and I type in Ubuntu, you'll notice I don't have an Ubuntu instance of WSDL actually on my machine. So no, the WSDL, I have no WSDL distro. All I did was enable WSDL 2. I just sat there and told Docker run inside of a WSDL 2 environment, and it then will sit there and get my right distros for me based on the images that I'm pulling down. Good question. So we've got that. Let's jump on. So I'm going to ignore this part now. So let's actually, or not ignore it. We're going to start building our website because that's really what you guys are here for now. So let's just start. Let's start off with a .NET new empty, right? Let's kick this beast off. So there, again, now that I've got .NET installed, I can now run all of my .NET commands. I probably should have put it in a separate directory, so my dev container, that's okay. No, you know what, now I'm torn. No, we'll leave it, that's fine. I usually try to keep my dev container more to root than inside of my actual app, but we're neither here nor there, it's okay. This is a hello world. You guys don't care about project structure, you care more about dev containers and Raspberry Pis anyway. So what you'll see here now is, so now if I come in here, and anyone who's ever done any development inside of Visual Studio Code will sit there and let me do this. You get this wonderful, hey, do you want to install the recommended extensions for C#? And 9 times out of 10, when I'm running on my normal machine, I would actually say install. But the thing that's nice about dev containers, right, is I should be able to sit here and allow someone to have the same experience that I have, or I should be able to sit there and take this, I should be able to check my code into GitHub or into some other source code repository, Azure DevOps or your choice, right? Or even just put it on a zip drive, there we go. There's dating myself because no one uses zip drives anymore, thumb drives. I should be able to put it on a thumb drive and just hand it off to someone and they should be able to pull it up, right? I mean, I want them to have the exact same experience that I do. So I don't want to actually install this extension here. I want to actually come back into my dev container and I can actually sit here now inside this dev container and tell it what extensions I want. And no, I do not have extensions memorized. So you guys are going to actually lose out on the magic of copy paste. But the extension right now that it's asking if I want to install is actually named that. It's the ms.NET tools.c#, right? This is the tooling. And in fact, to show you how I know what that name is, if I did come over here, and you'll see my dev container doesn't have any instances installed, but if I came over here and I said I want the C#, usually this is the one, I knew that was going to come up fast. This is the name. So here's your extension name, right? So whenever you look up an extension, you'll always find the extension name right up here. That's the name that you actually want to put inside of your extension section, so that now next time when I fire up this dev container, and in fact, let's do that, right? Let's do this. And now, yes, one of the fun things, so a lot of times you want to get your dev container.json file. It's okay to tweak it here and there, but this isn't like a reload on the fly type of thing. Unfortunately, now by me doing this, it doesn't just go out and install the extension magically. I have to reload my image. Now, it's not going to take as long because I don't have to pull down the image again. I've already got the image now pulled down locally, so it's going to find it locally. But I do, every single time I make a change to this dev container.json, I do need to rebuild my container. So we're going to rebuild our container, but it's not going to take nearly as long because it doesn't have to do the download. And so what you'll see now when this guy comes back up is you'll see, okay, we've got it. We're starting the container already. I'm not doing a download or anything like that because it actually saw that I already have the container downloaded and we're current. My code is not gone actually. So that's a good question. So I'm currently in the extensions window. My code is not gone because remember, I am running. So this is one thing that's really cool. And we'll come back to, let me bring this guy up again. This is one thing I know, again, too many tabs that even I get confused on. This is one thing that's nice. You'll notice here, my source code is actually sitting on my local machine. This is inside of my C source IntelliText samples user group directory. So my code is not running, my code does not only live inside my container. My code actually lives on my local machine, and then it's getting shared out to my container. So I'm doing all of my dev on the code and all my compilation on my code inside my container, but my source code itself actually lives over here on my local OS. You can see it just does a volume mount for that. So when I come back here, you'll now see my dev container does have the C# extension installed. If I come back here to my file explorer, you'll see I have all my code here, and there's this guy. And now I get lovely, now it's going to sit there and it's going to do all the .NET Core debugger stuff and everything else. But here now I should, if once all the language server stuff pops up, we'll get IntelliSense and all that fun stuff, right? So let's see, services, let's see if it's there yet. No, it's not there yet. But we now have the C# extension. So now anyone who takes this dev container, like if I were to push this up into GitHub right now, and you guys pulled it down, and you brought it down and you open it up inside of VS Code, you would already now have this, because it's set up inside of here, this extension would actually go. And yes, I am going to, there's a couple other extensions that I usually always push in here. Sure, we can do that. This is not necessarily this is now an artifact of the extension. Now the extension is saying, hey, I know that this is now a C# application. Let's install some assets for you so that you can actually, install some VS Code, launch, and this just sets up your debugger and stuff like that. But this would not have actually prompted me for this without having this extension installed. Because at this point in time, before that extension was installed, yes, it has a C# extension, a CS extension on it, but really to VS Code, it didn't mean anything until we got the language server installed, which happened to be by that guy. So now if I do services dot, it should get some magic here. There we go. So now you see I get full-blown IntelliSense. So I don't know how many people have used VS Code before as their actual editor. I use it a lot for web development and stuff like that. And I have been finding, you'll notice I don't have, I keep pointing, and I don't know if you guys can see my hands because I can't remember where I cropped my webcam at. I don't have Visual Studio proper actually installed on this at all. I've only got VS Code installed on my machine. So it's not that I've been trying to use VS Code more and more, but I have been using it more and more just because a lot of my day-to-day development now happens to be more around the website, and VS Code is actually awesome when it comes to, for me, I prefer VS Code when I'm doing a lot of my web development because of a lot of the extensions that people have written for it over actually using Visual Studio itself. One thing I do want to call out here too is you will notice, since I am running in a dev container, one thing that is nice is Visual Studio Code does try to give you some hints that that's where you're running at, right? I've got this dev container down here in the bottom left-hand corner that was not there before. And when I mouse over it, you can see it's editing on dev container. You can also see, and every time I mouse over it, then does that. But you'll notice up here, and I'll just make that big so the little icons there disappear or don't cover it. You'll notice up here, it actually does show, hey, you're editing your user group directory, but you're editing it from within your dev container. It's not that I'm editing it on my local machine. I'm actually editing this all. Yes, the files live on my local machine, but I'm doing all of my editing itself. All my capabilities are coming from my dev container. So you kind of get some good visual prompts that you're actually working inside of a dev container. So let's actually now make this a ASP. Oh, actually, we don't need to at this point in time. We are an ASP.NET Core application. If we jump over here to our terminal and I do this, one thing that you will notice here, so let me just do this. I'm going to do .NET Run. And I guess the question is for people that know Docker, and I mean, yeah, you guys can either speak up or you can throw it in the chat or however you're comfortable speaking up. For people who know Docker, and even for people who don't, I guess I'm now working inside of my, and that kind of gave away the answer. That sucks. I'm now working inside of a container, right? And a lot of times when you're working with containers, you need to sit there and say, hey, what are you going to show between your main machine and your container, right? What are you going to allow to escape from the container? So when you look at this image, you'll see that we have, by default, just by doing the magic of the dev container, it automatically does a volume mount. But you'll also see they talk about these exposed ports, right? My local OS, technically, my local OS is not running anything because I can't run .NET. All of my stuff is actually running inside my container. So now I'm sitting here inside my container. I just fired up my application and I see all these messages that sit here and say, in fact, let me make that bigger so we don't have to scroll. But you can see I get the typical messages. Hey, it's now listening on localhost 5001 and it's now listening on localhost 5000 for HTTPS and HTTP. But my local host itself doesn't have anything. My dev container localhost has it. So how do I get to it, right? I mean, I didn't expose my VS or my dev container. That file is very basic. I don't have anything exposed. I'm not saying, hey, share this or anything like that. So the question is do you think I'm actually, if I bring up a browser, do you think I'm actually going to be able to hit my website? Because technically it's running inside my dev container, and I'm not bringing up a browser in my dev container. My dev container is just my .NET process. It's not my Windows machine, right? This is still all running on my local, this is still running on my physical machine. This is running inside of a Docker container. Will I be able to hit it with a browser? And we will, I always go incognito when I do this stuff. So who thinks if I hit enter here, this is going to work? HTTP localhost 5000. We have one person who thinks it will work. We have one person who doesn't think it will work. Anyone, any other takers? Okay, Kevin's with Phil. So let's hit enter here. And it does. So I honestly, and I know I sound shocked, and I actually was when this actually worked out correctly the first time. That's one of the joys actually here of dev containers is if I actually come over here and I know what I want to do, I want to, oh, and of course yeah, I'm cheating. I took notes. But now I want to, let's do this. I think that I can still do this. If I go into my settings, so open user settings. So one thing that's nice is now if I type in remote here, and now I'm going to make this guy smaller. If we look at remote, there are 6 settings on remote, and one of them by default, and if this doesn't work, let me close this because I've not seen, it should be, okay. Oh yeah, right here, the first one, remote, auto forward ports. So I was not expecting that to actually happen, but it looks like when you install this remote dev container stuff, it will actually sit there and say, okay, when you have this checked. So if I didn't have this checked, I would not be able to, that magic would not work. But by having this checked, anything that I actually am doing inside of my dev container, when it sits there and tries to run a process, it will automatically expose that port outside. And so I can prove that here by, let's come back over here, right? And we sat there. So inside of properties, for people who are not aware, when you do a .NET run, this is what controls your application URL, right? So technically we are still running, I believe. Let me come back here. Let's kill this. If I then change this to 4001 and 4000, and I save it, and I do a .NET run, we're building, and you'll then notice that this is eventually going to, and I'll make this bigger. We're building, and now you can see I'm listening on port 4000 and 4001. WSDL pops up and tells me, or VS Code pops up this little thing. I never click on the open in browser just because I always run in my incognito window, right? So if I bring back this incognito window, and I now change this to 4000, I'm hitting my website. Now 5000, we're not listening to it anymore on, right? Because 5000 is dead. We sat there and said, hey, when I've launched this up, I want you to launch on 4000. So it's automatically exposing those ports for us. It's not a matter of having to go into Docker and say, hey, can you expose these ports for me or anything like that. VS Code is automatically going to do that. They're trying to make this experience as awesome as possible. So with that being said, though, now the fun part is shift home, HTTPS, because everyone does HTTPS stuff now, right? 5001. I'm going to say, oh, not 5001, because we changed it. See, this is where old habits die hard, right? If I come back to 4001, if I go to 4001, well, now my connection is not private. So I don't have a cert. This is the fun thing. For anyone who's done .NET development, the first time that you actually try to sit there and fire up your anything .NET, right? At least if you're on a Windows or a Mac machine, it will, or I should say at least Windows. I guess I haven't tried it per se on my Mac. On a Windows machine, the first time you bring it up, it will sit there and do this little pop-up saying, hey, we're going to install a certificate for you. Are you okay with this? Yada, 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 right? Well, I didn't get that because I'm not running again, this isn't running now on my local machine. This is running inside of my container. So it's not going to be able to sit there and create all of those certs for me. So how do I get the cert generated? Because I can't do, I mean, anyone who's ever done this before, and now I'm going to butcher the command because I don't have it as a copy paste. So I'm going to actually have to steal it. You guys are going to see some of my magic here. So yeah, or not necessarily magic, but there's my dev container. Oh, that's actually what I do want. You know what? We will get into HTTPS. I'm not going to talk on that yet, but well, right. Can you trust the .NET Dev cert? I can trust the .NET Dev cert. The problem is my .NET Dev cert is going to get generated inside of my container. It's not going to be generated inside. I mean, I can't type inside of this guy to do that fun little, the .NET Trust thing, right? Whatever that is. I can't type that here because I don't have .NET here. If I did a .NET Trust over here, it would be running inside my container. It's not going to sit there and put it into my actual machine side of things. So what we're going to do is I've now talked, it's not that I've talked myself in circles. I'm now trying to figure out, this is the fun part, is I'm trying to figure out what direction I want to go. And I am going to we're going to take a pause. Pretend I didn't necessarily say anything yet about SSL. We are going to circle back to that. We're going to take a pause because a lot of times too, what you want to be able to do inside of these, and this is why I want to talk on this really quick, is when you're doing web work, and we're not going to be getting into anything that fancy, right? But 9 times, I shouldn't even say 9 times, probably 99% of the time that you do anything with web stuff, you're doing something with Node, right? And I don't have Node installed on this. I don't have NPM installed on this. So, because remember, all I've currently got in my dev container is I'm saying, hey, pull down the Microsoft provided image. And then I'm also sitting there and install this extension. So I need to somehow inside of this dev container also install other software. Now, what I'm going to show you, I'm not going to say is the way that you would necessarily want to do this. In a real machine. In a real machine, what you'd end up doing is instead of trying to build this all in your dev container.json, you would truly build up a Docker file, which we're actually going to use. So there's 3 ways. Let me take a step. I am going to take a step back now. There's 3 ways that you can actually spin up an image inside of a dev container. You can specifically link directly to the image. You can actually point to a Docker file that you've already created. You'll notice I don't have a Docker file in here right now. We're going to eventually tear down this instance and we're going to add a Docker file to this, a proper Docker file to it. One that Microsoft actually provides. We're gonna cheat in that regard. I just wanted to get you guys familiar with this syntax here first. And this is one thing I haven't done. And I do want to kind of goof around with this. So it recognizes image, it recognizes Docker file. It also recognizes, and someone can correct me either verbally or in chat, it recognizes when you have more than one Docker file more than one Docker instance that you need to spin up. You kind of drive that with a YAML file, if I remember correctly, and I can't remember the exact piece to it, but basically you can actually have it spin up that. So there's some instances when we go on a little bit later, you'll see that there's some instances that actually have a development environment that is a dev environment plus a database. And so that's actually going to sit there and that would spin up your dev environment in one Docker image where you did all your dev work, and then it would also spin up your database in another Docker image. And it would make sure that it spun them up in the right order for you and everything else. And again, I can't remember that terminology, but if there's any Docker gurus out there, please feel free to speak up on what that. It's not a Docker cluster, but it's something like that. So you can actually do that all with these dev containers as well. So I do want to show you this, not necessarily a hack, but another command or another piece that you can do here, and then we will get into generating a Docker image proper as well. So what I mean by that is here you can actually do. So you'll notice I get a whole bunch of, so one thing that's nice about this, right, is since it knows it's a dev container, I get some IntelliSense. And so I can sit here now and I can say, hey, you know what, after you create, so after this image has been created, after my Docker container has been created, I want to run some more commands. And yeah, I'm not going to make you guys watch me type this in here. But again, this is going to require you to know some Unix commands or Linux commands because I'm doing it. And this is where things do get a little interesting. So here, you'll notice now I'm going to try to run some Linux commands. In particular, I'm running Debian Linux commands, right? Because I'm trying to use apt, or what used to be apt-get now seems just to have been shortened to apt. So I'm basically sitting there and saying, hey, for your package manager that you use for installing stuff, go out and run an update. And then I want you to go out and I want you to install Node.js and I want you to install NPM. Now, these are going to be going to the Debian library, which I've noticed are kind of older versions. So that's what I'm saying is I would probably never do this if I was trying to do this in a real world. I would actually use a Docker file. I wouldn't be trying to install these through post create commands, because what's going to happen is every single time I create this image, every single time I rebuild this image, yeah, it's going to have this stuff downloaded locally. So it's not going to have to go out and get my Docker image for me again, because the image is already going to be downloaded. And as long as it hasn't been updated, I'm still going to have the current one there. So I'm not going to have to actually download a new image. But every time this container gets built, it's going to have to go back out and install and run these commands. So it's going to install Node.js every single time I rebuild, not reopen per se, because my container's still going to be there. But every time I do that rebuild step, it's going to run these post create commands. But let me do that. And we are now going to rebuild this guy. And this would be a great time to ask questions, because this is going to take a little while. Because now I'm going to rebuild my container. And this time now it's going to go out and actually install all of that stuff. So if we look at starting dev container here, and we can do the show log. So this would actually be a good place to, if you were doing a lot of web stuff, or if this was a web instance that you were actually trying to do, which we are at this point in time, yes, npm I, right? To do if you had Node inside your Docker image already, this post create command, this would be a great time to do npm I, because that's going to sit there then and say, okay, my Docker image is actually up and running. Now let's go out and get the assets that are local for what you're actually trying to do. So it would be a good idea to do an npm I, basically install the Node packages that I actually want for my application inside of this post create command. Trying to do a post create command on an image, like trying to install this stuff. Yes, and of course I don't know, where is it? Terminal. So you can see here, I'm still trying to configure, right? So this is my terminal for my, that's showing out the logging. I'm still trying to run these apt updates, apt installs. This would be a great place to actually sit there and say, hey, install the packages that I want that I've got inside of my package.json file. This is not a good place to sit there and say, go out and actually install Node and NPM into my instance, because you don't get it cached. It's going to do this every single time that this thing comes down, or that you actually rebuild your container. If you did this inside of a Docker file, that Docker image would be cached locally on your machine, and it wouldn't have to do this Node.js install and this npm install to get the actual applications every single time you rebuilt your container. It would only download the dependencies that your actual project needs, if that makes sense. Now I feel like I might be talking in a circle, so I hope that made sense. But you can see by doing this adds a lot of time on trying to build my container, or trying to get this thing going. So this is not necessarily the ideal way of doing this, because yeah, you can see we're installing Python, we're installing a whole bunch of stuff to be able to install the Node.js and npm executables is really what this is doing. Progress 5%. Yeah, we might actually just kill this, because this was not what I wanted to do anyway, and I don't want to spend too much time on this talk waiting for this progress to go. So yeah, let's wonder if I can just shut this down. Okay, we're going to assume that we can just shut that down. And what I want to do now is I'm going to come and open up user group. I'm not going to open up in the dev container. So sorry, I am relaunching Visual Studio Code because I killed it. And I am not going to be opening it up inside the dev container. I'm actually opening it up. So you'll notice here, I've got it just as my user group, which is opening it up on my local file system. I'm not opening it up from within the container because I did not want this guy to run. I want to get rid of him. But one thing that is nice is, so you'll notice down here, because I have that extension installed, I have the remote containers extension installed, it recognizes that I open this up locally, but it also recognizes, hey, you've got a dev container.json file that's living here. So did you mean to open this up inside of a container, or did you actually want to open it up just on your local file system? So I could actually, from inside of here, just say reopening container. I don't want to do that because I do not want this post create command to run. And actually what I want to do is we're going to kill this guy actually completely. Shift delete. We want to get rid of that, because what we actually want to do now is that's kind of the long and short of how to get a dev container up and running from scratch. I have not had a need for that yet, because most of the dev containers that I use, so Microsoft has a nice repository of dev containers already, and I usually just steal those. And so how you end up actually stealing, I say steal, yeah. How you end up getting those is I can actually now come in here, and by opening up my command tools here, if I say remote containers, I can actually sit here and say, I want to add a development container configuration file. So this is now saying, hey, you know what? So because what you'll notice here, let me take a step back. What you'll notice here is I could actually attach to a running container. If I already had a container that had stuff that had an environment set up the way I wanted and it was already running, I could actually attach to that in my file system, and then I could mount my files into that. It would automatically mount the files into that, and I could just be running on that. I don't have an existing container. And you'll see we have, if I open up this Docker, you'll notice we do have our MCR containers. I've got my images, right? I got the latest and the 3.1 that we pulled down. So these are the images that I have locally. Here's the container that we were running this last time. So it gives it a fun little name, right? Flamboyant Ramen apparently was the name for this one. And so this is the actual image. We haven't killed the image, or we haven't killed the container. This was the latest container that we were actually developing in. And each time that you spin up a container, you will get one here. Each time you download an image. So this was cached and this was cached. And you can see, I guess, so I made the comment about you, as long as they were rebuilt recently or weren't rebuilt recently, it won't have to go back out and do a download. Apparently, these were actually rebuilt just a little while ago. These were built 10 hours ago. So when I was doing, if I would have tried to open up an existing image that I created yesterday, it would have sat there and went, oh, there's a newer version of 3.1 out there. I'm going to go pull that down, because you can see the images are actually, I didn't download this 10 hours ago. These were empty when we started the talk. So these images were actually created 10 hours ago. Microsoft created a new update apparently on these. But so I could actually attach. I could just come in here and say, actually, how do you do that? I should be able to. There's a way that you can. Well, I could have. Oh, it's not running. So I would have to get this guy started, and then I would be able to right-click on this and say, hey, I want to attach to an existing container, or to an existing executing container. But I can also come up here and remote containers. I want to add a development container configuration file. Because remember, we whacked, now I deleted that .devcontainer.json file. So one thing that's nice is, and this was kind of where I got into a lot of this stuff when I was first goofing around with my dad, was I sat there and he's like, hey, I want to get Python installed, or I want to get C# installed or something. If I look at all definitions, you'll notice I didn't have a scroll bar before, right? So I now have a scroll bar. And you can see basically if I wanted to spin up a Python container, I could come here and I could spin up a Python 3 container, or this is what I was talking about. I could spin up a Python 3 and a PostgreSQL. This is not going to have PostgreSQL in the same container as Python 3. This is going to spin up a Python 3 container for me, and then spin up a separate PostgreSQL database container for me, and it will have the ports actually connected so they can actually talk to each other. So you can do that. So I can now, but I want to pick C#. We're still just doing C#. I don't need SQL or anything like that. So let me pick the C# one. And this is one thing that's kind of nice is C# then, so there's a couple of menu options now that they give you, right? Is I could have picked a 2.1 version, a 3.1 version, or I'm going to stay with 5.0. And now it's going to sit here and also ask me, oh, by the way, do you want to install Node.js? So this is what I was saying. I would probably never, I would, well, not that I would probably, I know I would never use that post install or post create container piece to install Node. You'd want to actually use an actual Docker file that already has it there so you can get that cached. So, but now when Microsoft sits here, they've got some templates out there and they're like, hey, do you want to install Node.js? Do you want to install the Azure CLI inside this Docker file so that you don't always have to do it? I always just pick the Node.js. I don't necessarily need the Azure CLI for anything. So let me click OK here. And now you'll notice here inside of my file system, and before I open it up, you'll notice now that instead of it being that .devcontainer.json file, I now have a .devcontainer directory. And inside of that .devcontainer directory, I have a devcontainer.json file. And this guy is now, and you'll see this is why I started out simple, right? We basically just had image and called it good. We had image and extensions, and that was really all that we had. Here you can actually see, oh, I now want to actually use a Docker file. And so I want to do a build of a Docker file, and here's some parameters that I'm passing into it. And here's the Docker file that it's actually going to be trying to run. So it sits there and says what version of, so Microsoft actually has, you'll notice this is a little different than the container that we pulled down before. This is not the actual, so Microsoft went out and put dev containers around their SDKs, around their SDK containers. So there's extra stuff in this container that does not live inside of that SDK container. And you can see it's going to sit there and say, hey, go out and grab based on the variant. And I can set my variant. If I set it to nothing, I'm going to get 5.0 or whatever this value is. But I can control that also here. I could change this to 3.1 if I wanted to pull down a 3.1 instance. I actually want to still do a 5.0. If I picked the wrong answer on when we were going through the wizard on install node, I can always change this to false. I want to leave that as true. This is now actually asking me what version of node I want to install and everything else. And do I want to install the CLI? You'll notice here, it is going to install that one extension for me. So by default now, by pulling down their C# container, they sat there and went, well, you know what? You're trying to do some C# development stuff. Let's give you some of the C# tools that we know you're going to need. If I were to have pulled down the Python one, it would not have installed this extension, and it would not even be installing this Docker file that's got .NET in it, right? It would be installing a Python Docker file, and then it would actually install Python extensions for me. So I get my development environment up and running for me without having to figure out, oh, what extensions are nice to have. This just kind of gives you a nice clean, yeah, exactly. It's a more precise install. So I'm not dirtying up my VS Code with a ton of extensions because I might be doing Python or I might be doing PHP or I might be doing C#. I only get the extensions that I need installed when I actually open those up. So I'm going to Control Z out of this just to make sure I didn't muck anything up there. But you'll notice here, so still very similar to our file, except instead of image, we now have a build. We're still doing the extensions. And yeah, so here's the stuff that I was actually trying to do. This is where we're going to actually, the nice thing is, right, they talk about, and we will walk through all this, they talk about what you should actually do to be able to get your certs working. And so we will talk about that. You can see here, when we mentioned the post create command, the question came up on, oh, would this be a good time to install node packages? Yes, it would. And in fact, here they've got it commented out, but they kind of sit there and say, hey, this is not a bad place to do a .NET restore. So if you, yeah, in fact, we can do that. Well, I don't necessarily need to do that because it does a restore automatically. But if I wanted to do a .NET restore, so it would restore everything that was currently needed inside of my CS proj, I could uncomment that command and be golden. Now, there is one thing I want to do here before I fire this up, because I don't want to have to keep bouncing things back and forth, is so some of the magic. So this is, we will talk about HTTPS now, right? And so, sorry, I know I jump all over the place. You guys get used to it. Forward ports. You'll notice we don't need to forward the ports, right? If I didn't have that feature turned on earlier that sat there and said automatically forward ports, I would need to do this. And then I would need to make sure that now see, this would not work for me right now, because if I were to uncomment this, if I took out the piece that sat there and said automatically forward the ports that are exposed, if I took that out, this would actually break right now in my setup, because remember, we came into our launch settings and sat there and said, we're launching on 4000 and 4001. So that setting is huge, because you don't have to worry about getting these two files in sync anymore. It's going to automatically do the right thing by forwarding whatever ports I've actually got configured here, because it's going to forward any port that that my container tries to use, instead of something that I'm explicitly saying, okay, open up these ports. So one thing that I do want to do, and I'm going to bring this guy, okay, good, we are over here. I want to actually create a directory here. So let's go to C:users Stokes. I want to create this directory that they have right here. I want to, wait, where is it? Come on, where's my, oh yeah, I want this guy, my mount. So I'm gonna, on my user profile, which is my C:users Stokes, I want to create a directory, new, which is always fun because I have to put it down at the bottom, .ASP.NET. I'm going to create another directory called HTTPS. And why I'm doing that is because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to explicitly now, I'm going to actually uncomment this line. I want to add some extra file system mounts. So by default, it mounts my source code into the dev container. It mounts this guy. I also am now saying, hey, by the way, mount whatever. So this is where it's fun, right? So this syntax looks kind of weird. But the reason why this is here is this is what actually works, right? It's kind of a hack, but it works cross-platform. So if you're running on Mac or Linux, this environment:home is actually going to be set. So you'll get that value there. And user profile will be blank. So basically it's saying append some text to something blank and then go to this directory. If you're running on Windows, environment:home is going to be blank, and environment, I think I'm saying that correctly, and environment user profile is going to be populated. I might have that backwards. Yeah, you guys are going to sit here and see. One guy actually wrote a really good post on this that talked about Joule and how this actually worked, because I was confused by how that actually worked. Yeah, so sharing data. So handling multiple platforms. On Windows, user profile is set and home is set. Yeah, so I did have that right. So on Windows now, user profile is going to be my C:/user/Stokes. This is actually going to be blank. So it's going to basically take a blank string, append my user profile on it, and get it here. On Linux or Windows or Linux or Mac, you're going to get a string with a value, append a blank string onto it, and then do that. So this is kind of how you get these to work on all of the environments, is just by knowing which environment variables are set and not set on different machines. So I want to actually mount an extra place that goes to my HTTPS, because here's what because the magic here is going to actually happen, and you guys can probably read this you guys probably have already read this as I'm talking, but what we're actually going to do is we're going to export the cert from our container to our local machine. We are then going to manually add that into our cert manager so that we actually trust it. And then what we'll end up doing is we'll always end up using, so once we create it, we're going to actually then we'll uncomment this when we come back in. I can't uncomment this now because this doesn't exist, and it'll prevent my container from being able to open. I believe. I think that's how that works, because I think it pukes on one of these if it doesn't actually exist. So what we want to do is we're going to sit there and say, hey, mount my ASP.NET HTTPS directory to this now. And one thing that's tricky here is we're saying, okay, inside my container, mount it to home VS Code ASP.NET HTTPS. And I don't know if you guys remember before, but with how we were running before, we were running at home/root, because our container was running as root. We didn't specify a user. One thing you'll notice with these dev containers that Microsoft gives you is they usually have this down here at the bottom that is a remote user as named VS Code. So that's where this home comes from. This is not it's not a VS Code magic plugin thing. This isn't VS Code is not creating this for you. It's because of this dev-container.json file that we're specifying this remote user, and inside of this Docker file, actually inside of this, is it library? No. Oh, yeah. So, sorry. Inside of this Docker file, actually inside of this Docker image, they're actually already creating a user called VS Code. The way that I know that is if I come over here, one thing that's nice about all of these images is all of these images actually live out on GitHub. So Microsoft has all of their dev container images, and here happens to be the .NET dev container image. And so when I'm pulling down that Docker file, it's actually, you'll notice it's this same Docker file. This is exactly what we see. But what this Docker file actually consists of is defined here in this base Docker file. So you'll notice here, we weren't using Focal, right? We were using the other one. So this image that's coming down is actually going to be an Ubuntu image, because their dev container image actually pulls down the Ubuntu version of the .NET SDK, not the Debian version. And you'll notice here they're actually creating a VS Code. They actually create the VS Code user here. So it's kind of some extra magic that they've done, but that's where this pathing, I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm just trying to make it clear as to where this is actually coming from. That's not a Visual Studio Code thing. That's a Docker image thing. So if we were to have changed this, or we were to change this, in fact, if I change this to blah, this would die, because this is now going to try to log me in as blah, and it's going to say blah does not exist. I need this to be VS Code, and it's because their Docker image is creating a user called VS Code. We're logging in as VS Code, which is why I'm allowed to mount, which is why I'm trying to now mount anything from my local system to the home VS Code location. So that being said, let's now reopen this guy in a dev container, because this is going to take a little while. So I couldn't talk through it. See, that's what stinks, is once I do this, I can't talk through it because it's going to sit there and try to create the containers and everything else, and I can't see it in my files when the containers are trying to go. So I'm not going to click on this, because we know we're pulling down a brand new image, because we're pulling down their Docker image, which is based on the SDK image that we were actually using earlier. And let's just hope that my internet stays up. I might actually talk the whole, I didn't think I was going to go this long. Oh, an error occurred. Okay, so unable to find VS Code. So I did butcher something, didn't I? Let's try this again. Sometimes retry works, and sometimes retry doesn't, and that would be because I butchered something somewhere along the lines, and I might have corrupted my dev container. Oh, it's still, no, that guy doesn't exist anymore. Hopefully it's not trying to launch that. Because we haven't even gotten to the fun stuff yet. I haven't even gotten to the Raspberry Pi stuff. And that's the only reason Phil showed up. So, oh, great. Okay, so open dev container locally. I butchered something somewhere. I know.
Do you think they're doing a disservice by abstracting away what's really going on with Docker here? Because this dev container JSON file is essentially a middleman for VS Code to set up your Docker file arguments, or I guess even to create the Docker file to begin with, and then setting up what arguments VS Code should expect to pass in when it runs the creates a container from whatever the specified image is. Because you could do all of this without dev container configurations, right? You're essentially would be piping in all of the CLI commands for Docker manually and then setting up some sort of proxy, I would imagine, in the VS Code settings.
Right. Yeah. So I think I understand. So I don't know if it's necessarily doing a disservice, because I think what they're trying to do is make it so that you don't have to know Docker. I don't know if this is their way of trying to make it a little more approachable, or a little more approachable. Oh, wow. So I wonder if they've got something messed up with their
error, which I can imagine people being, bashing their head against the wall because they don't think they're not interacting directly with Docker, or they're not setting this stuff up and knowing, well, why is this? You don't have access to figure out, well, why is this scaling all of a sudden?
Right. Like what we're running into right now.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, ultimately, you're going to be pushing a container out to deploy it as well, right? I mean, container is going to be your deployment unit when you push something out.
So this is not I would not deploy this container because this container is really more for development than it is for. I wonder if that's what's messing
right.
up.
Okay.
This is more for development than it is actually for actual deployment. Because I would probably deploy out on Alpine, right? You'd want to deploy out on something as small as possible and everything else. Let's remove this. Let's remove this. And I wouldn't need all my dev tools in there, right? I would just need the bare minimums when I was deploying stuff out. And in fact, that's the thing, right? Is I'm not even going to be deploying Docker. I'm not deploying a Docker image out when I deploy out to our Raspberry Pi. I'm going to just be deploying out the packages themselves. So let's try this. Select an image group. I don't want to select an image group. Escape. Let's try to reopen in container again. I wonder if I had some stale stuff. So yeah, not necessarily. And yeah, I really don't think so. I could see using this dev container for your build pipeline, but I don't think I'd take it out past a build pipeline. I think I'd have a different container that would be kind of in my release pipelines area. If this doesn't work, we're actually going to just go back to our image one so we can keep moving. But I'm hoping this is going to work. I'm hoping by reloading the containers, by repulling containers.
When you said you wouldn't use this as the container after development, doesn't that sort of defeat the purpose of containers?
So I guess because they added some extra features in here, because I guess the reason why I say I wouldn't use this necessarily after development is I would not deploy out my .NET application with Node.js and NPM and all those other pieces on it because it doesn't need it, right? So I definitely see one need for a development machine setup versus your deployment containers. So I can see us having two containers. I don't think it eliminates the need for containers because this is still giving me a nice clean environment to do all my development in. It's just not what I would actually use as my release container, if that makes sense. So, but I do understand your point because kind of the whole point behind containers is it gets past the works on my machine, right? And really what we're doing at this point in time with these dev containers is just getting beyond it works. I can dev on my machine, right? Right now, really the only problem we're solving is, okay, good. I must have had some bad stuff up and going. So we're up and going now. We're kind of solving the problem of, okay, I'm working on a project and I want to bring Kevin in on this project. Oh, Kevin, here's a 10-page document on how to set up your dev machine so you can be ready to work on my project. Where this dev container, that solves that problem. And that seems to be the problem that they're trying to solve here. They're not trying to necessarily solve the deployment problem. They're just trying to sit there and make the pain point of spinning up on a new project and have consistency across your team a little bit easier. Because when we spin up stuff, when we do our own machine stuff, we still run into those same issues of what is it that I need to, how do I get my machine configured correctly so that I can actually be up and running productively and ideally not taking 2 or 3 days in order to get that productivity back. Okay, so I got that. Now my problem is I do want to come in here though and restart this guy. Now on the bright side, I don't need to restart it. I don't need to do too much. I want to get this mount back. I should probably be able to do those as well, but we'll do it this way anyway. Did that answer your question? Sorry if that, or not necessarily answer your question, but did that kind of
yeah,
point
thank
in
you.
one direction or another? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Steve, I kind of danced around your question because I think there's, I see your point, but I wonder how many people have been intimidated by, I need to know Docker in order to get this to work. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's not really an answer to it. It's more of it gets you up and going pretty quick, but it also adds a whole extra layer of configuration around something that already has well documented configuration and ways of
Right.
doing things. But
no, that is true. Yeah. Okay, so I do not need to do this first one. I love how they actually give us this command where we don't need that command. I do want this one. So what I want to do here is I don't need to trust my cert locally because there's nothing. So this is usually the command, this first string is usually the command that you run on your local machine in order to install the dev cert into your system. Well, we're not installing the dev cert into our system because our system is this. What we want to do is we actually want to create the dev cert and we want to export it to a location, and we're going to then give it a password, and I'm going to pick the exact same password here of super secure password goes here. So if I open up a terminal here and I paste that in. Yep, that's fine. So valid HTTP. So now ideally, because we mounted that directory, if all went well, I'll now have so on my local machine now, because we went in and mounted that location, right? We mounted it inside, we basically sat there and said, hey, mount my file system into the Docker system. And then on the Docker system, we said, generate that PFX file PFX file so that I can actually, inside of that guy, I now have it on my local machine. So what I need to do now is on Cert Manager, manage computer. So I'm bringing up this guy, Cert Manager, right? What we all come to know and love. And I actually now want to import all tasks. I want to import that PFX file into this guy and mount that one. That will come later when we're actually doing some other fun stuff, if I can get that far. .ASP.NET, HTTPS, and I want the PFX. Next. And what was that password that we decided we were going to use? That was secure password goes here. Make sure we got that right. Yep. That's fine. Finish. Okay. So when you so long story short, what we basically did was we manually did what this .NET Dev Certs HTTPS Trust usually does, is we actually just manually came in and added our local host cert here. So now when I come back over here and I say .NET Run, we're going to build. And then if I come back to this guy, .NET NuGet access is denied. Okay, that's fun. Let's I obviously got myself in a fun state here. Let's delete that guy permanently. Permission denied. remove directory. Okay, well, let's do it. Cancel. Let's do it this way. When all else fails, right? It's sitting on our local machine. So funny. Someone actually asked me, hey, are you worried about demo failures? And I said, no, I'm not going to have any demo failures. I never have demo failures. Okay, there we go. Let's try this again. That's what I was wondering, but it looks like I could. I wonder if because I switched contain. Oh, that's what it was. So those files, I know it's going to sound weird. Well, I believe that this is what it was. Those files were created in my other dev container that we're running as root. Now we're trying to sit here and run as a VS Code user that doesn't have root access. And I have a feeling, yeah, clearly an amazing presenter. No, I just have really, I'm just really hopeful. I've got high hopes. So I think what actually happened was it was giving me permission denied because everything used to be running as root, and now I'm trying to run as a non-root user. So I believe that's what happened. But by deleting them out of our native file system, I was able to now rebuild them as VS Code user. And if I come back here now, I probably need to relaunch my browser so that my certs go. I'm not 100% sure. Let's do this. And now let's try HTTPS, localhost 4001. And if all goes right, we will actually get a secure site. There we go. So I know that was a real long roundabout way of doing that, but that's how you actually get HTTPS up and running inside of your and we only have to do this once. So this is one thing that's nice is now that I actually have this file, or that file, I'm not going to navigate back to it, but now that I actually have this ASPFX file, now what I would do is every single time that I came in, and yes, I'm going to do it on this one, but now also on any remaining, and I don't have to do that right. I don't have to do that right now because this one's already going to be installed. But now any new instance of a ASP.NET Core application that I'd launched or that I did a dev container for, I would want to uncomment this line and I'd want to uncomment this line because we've now generated this cert once. We've generated the PFX file and we've imported that into our trusted store or into our security or into our certificate manager. I want to reuse that same cert now on every single ASP.NET Core app or every single ASP.NET application that I actually am writing. I want to use that, reuse that inside of every Docker file. I don't want to have every Docker file generate a new cert. I want to reuse an existing one that I already trust. So yes, this was kind of a little bit of a pain, but it's a one-time setup. You do this once and you're done. From here on out now, if I create a new dev container, or if I create a new dev container, I uncomment these 2 lines or these 4 lines, 5 lines, and it will reuse that same cert over and over and over again, and I'll never actually have to worry about doing HTTPS stuff again with regards to my local host development. So now I'm really going to be flying here. Let's have some fun. So inside a startup, let's at least get a little bit of an MVC application. And oh, come on. There we go. Add controllers with views. We want to use routing. We want to do this. We want to say endpoints.map. Yes, I always wait for default controller route. There we go. So now I need to create a, nope, not a new file. Create a new directory. Controllers. Controllers, if I can type. Because, you know, I think, what was it? I think I was told once that the more people you have, that your number of typos increase exponentially based on the number of people that are actually watching. So home, new file, index.cshtml. Where I'm going with this right now. So one thing that's actually kind of cool is, and you guys may have not felt this pain before. I'm not sure, again, how many people have actually done ASP.NET Core development. Yeah, no, you can't. You guys get to stick around. If I have to go through this, so do you. I'm not sure how many people have done ASP.NET Core development before, but I believe it was with 5.0, they came out with this .NET watch command. .NET Watch has existed for a while, but one of the things they added to ASP.NET Core applications was .NET Watch was supposed to do kind of an auto reload. And that seemed all hunky-dory and all, except for the fact that it did not work. And then they actually had it was awesome because they actually had a line in the code that showed, that actually specifically said this, that was like, don't actually enable this if you're running on Linux, or if you're running on Linux, only enable it if you're running on Windows. Controller. Why does that look like I'm doing something wrong? Code, oh yeah, okay, that's fine. Let's save these, save this. Failed to save this is going to be the bane of my existence. Okay. Because so you guys would never run into this because you would not be stupid like me and actually start up your project in one instance of a dev container running as root, and then decide you're going to jump over to a completely different dev container running as something else. No, Phil, you're not that bad. Want to continue. Come on, I want to close down. I want to kill all those. Okay, are they going to delete for me? Okay, that's fine. We should have canceled that. We're going to just do it this way. Sudo, right? That'd be funny. So that is one thing. That's a good point. Oh no, I guess that's more of the SSH stuff. Yeah, some of the commands like that do not necessarily work inside of. It's not the dev containers that you run into this. It's going to be more of the issues that you would have around the remote SSH. Sudo doesn't work right in remote SSH. .NET new empty. Okay, so where I was going to go with this whole thing was, and I'm not going to have a chance to show it if we even want to. Well, so that's the thing is, I don't know if we're going to get a chance to get into the Raspberry Pi deployment or not, which is really unfortunate because this thing ends at 8 o'clock. So now I'm trying to figure out, we'll just talk. I'll talk to it. So .NET Watch specifically didn't work in Linux. If you have an MVC application that does more than just this hello world, .NET Watch now works as of .NET list SDKs. As of the one, that's funny. This is a different, they have not, that was the problem. They haven't updated their container. Sorry. So I don't know if you guys noticed, but I've now got so many different things going. As of the 5.0.200, which actually is the latest MCR Microsoft SDK instance, which it looks like their dev container is not pulling down the actual latest. It's still pulling down the 103. They actually fixed .NET Watch. So .NET Watch, when you're working with an MVC application, will actually work from an auto refresh perspective when you're working in dev containers. It didn't used to work before because they took off the auto refresh feature if you were running inside of Linux for some reason. Okay, but that's not even, I can't even show that because it's not available in this version. So that saved me a demo failure by doing that one. So let's actually, okay, so we got that. Let's actually do a quick Pi deployment. Let's see how far we can get on this. So we're good there. So what we want to do is I'm going to deploy out my application. So let's quickly do this. We want to do, because this is going to take a little while, so I'm going to let this run in the background. I want to do a .NET publish, and we're going to target a runtime. I'm not sure how many other people have targeted runtimes before, but because I don't have .NET actually installed on my Pis, I've got to sit there now and target a runtime and make it a self-contained executable. So I need to target, even though I'm currently running on a x64 based system, I need to target the runtime of an ARM64 because I want to put this on a Pi. Thank you, Nicole. Yes. This is going to be a real quick fire hose 15 minutes. And so I do the publish trim equals true in order to try to give me as small of a package as possible. And I'm going to go self-contained. So let's do this. And we're going to let that run. I'm going to publish that out. And while that's publishing out, we're going to come over here and let's now, so on my Pis, like I mentioned, I've got Nginx actually installed on the Pis already. So I'm going to SSH as Ubuntu into my Pi web. And you can see I'm not even taxing this thing all that much, but that's some of the fun stuff that you can see whenever you do this. And we need to actually make some changes. So I have Nginx installed. I want to actually go in now and I want to create basically I want to expose my site via Nginx. So I need to go into my Nginx directory, and you can install Nginx fairly easily just through npm command. So that didn't seem all that interesting to actually walk you guys through that. But some of the configuration stuff is actually interesting. So I've already got, I'll talk through this file, but I'm going to copy a Stokesbury file that I already have up and running. So yeah, my Pis actually are working. I just can't launch the website right now, but I might actually, you know what? Instead of getting this one working, why don't I just do this? Can I make that full screen? There we go. I'm going to just sudo nano Stokesbury and kind of talk through the file because I don't know if we're going to have time to get through all this in. Well, I've got a 15-minute warning, which basically means the group is supposed to end. So, Nicole, what does that mean with regards to how we're doing the drawing and everything else? Or any questions? I know you guys have been asking questions as we've been going, but I've got 13 minutes before I am dead in the water, I'm assuming, before Kevin just sits there and kills the feed. So
I would suggest that you end by 7:55.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So, oh no, Vim, I'm not that good. Yeah. So what you can see here is I've already created, so onto my Pis, I've already got my Stokesbury dev server up and running. And in particular, my blog that I don't actually have, that I have pushed out, but I'm not running anywhere. I actually have I own the Stokesbury.me domain. So I wanted to have a dev server that was mike.stokesbury.dev. So inside of Nginx, I configured a mike.stokesbury.dev. And I sat there and I said, okay, if it comes in on port 80, I want you to redirect all traffic to the HTTPS request. And so inside of here, I've now sat there and you'll notice, so these are some of the things that I've done is any request that comes in is mike.stokesbury.dev. I want to actually pass on, I want to make a proxy pass to this localhost 5003. So this is my ASP.NET Core. I've actually configured that ASP.NET Core application to be running on port 5003, and I want any request that comes in to forward onto that. So I'm basically using this purely as a proxy pass-through, like what we're used to with stuff like that. So I've got that guy up and going. And then what I've also got is, you notice that I did have some certs, right? So if I do a cd ... I have some snippets over here. One snippet that is, so these basically all come, except for the mike.stokesbury cert and the Stokesbury cert, these already come this way out, and I did cheat already and try to start off doing a user group configuration as well. But if I do a sudo nano on a mike.stokesbury cert.conf, this is actually a real simple file. I'm basically telling Nginx where to go to get the cert so I can actually do SSL. And so I've actually created some local certs, just some local dev certs that are set up to work with, that are secured down to a mike.stokesbury.dev URL. And so I'm just kind of configuring Nginx in order to be able to do that. And this is what you needed to do to say, okay, Nginx, what are the certs for the key and the main cert? What are those? Where do those live? And so it was just easier to put these kind of in separate configuration files than it was to put it inside that main one, just because I was thinking I was going to be able to reuse these certs. So that's why I put them out into this. Come to find out, since I'm not doing a wildcard cert, I basically could have inlined these because it's just 2 extra lines. But I was trying to be a little more dynamic than what it actually allowed me to be. So I needed to go in and actually set it up as an available site, tell Nginx about this site, right? When the request comes in, this guy actually forward on the request. I then also had some cert stuff that I need to set up. And those certs actually live, if you remember, if I do a cd tilde, I then have my mike.stokesbury.dev. This is where my actual site itself lives. My certs actually live here. If I do a Stokesbury, you'll notice this is where those where that file was pointing to. It was pointing to the CRT and also the key file. So I've just kind of placed those there. The way that I generated these actually was with the help of a script that I actually had. If I do a cd ... and I ls here, yeah, see that the publish was going to take a while. I basically created a cert authority, and then I'm creating certs based off of those cert authorities. So what that allows me to do is, right now, if I were to come over to this guy, right now we're talking about all this. If I were to do an HTTP mike.stokesbury.dev, I'm basically going to get a, hey, your connection is not private. And I can't actually even say ignore this, right? This is the thing that stunk about Chrome, was you can't just sit there and say, hey, ignore this warning. You actually have to have a legit cert. So again, the same way that we did a trusted root cert authority for localhost, when I actually generated these CAs, I copied this cert actually all over to my local machine. So I actually, inside of my downloads, I went ahead and already have that copied over inside of my search directory. So there's my CRT. So now if I actually import that CRT into this, and again, this is one thing that's nice, is this is a one-time setup that I actually had to do, because I'm using that same certificate authority on all of my dev sites that I'm actually running on this Pi. So if I just sit there and I browse to my downloads and I go into my search and I import this guy, next, finish. Import was successful. Now you'll notice that I have not just the local host, but I also have a development cert. So this is the CA that I actually just pulled in. And now if I come back here, I wonder if I just do an F5. Yeah, I didn't think that was going to work. If I come back out here, where's my browser? Where'd it go? Come on. Pop up, there we go. Control-Shift-N, HTTP mike.stokesbury.dev. It should hit the Nginx on HTTP, redirect to HTTPS, and there's my actual HTTPS that's running on my Raspberry Pi. I know that was quick and dirty, and I didn't necessarily get to walk through things. I will actually, since this is being recorded, I will throw this up here, because this is actually, no, not that one. Oh, do I not have it? I might need to give you guys these as I wanted. So this was an actual, so this is actually a good walkthrough on, oh, that was the other piece that I did. This was a good walkthrough on how to get Nginx up and running on your machine, as well as what you needed to do in order to get SSL working. He used CertBot to set up his stuff. I didn't use CertBot. I used another one, and I was hoping I'll share that URL actually when we post this video, because I'm not finding it. But it was a GitHub. There was a GitHub piece of software that I used that gave me those. That basically gave me these SSH, the shell commands in order to be able to generate. It gave me the create CA and the create cert, so that I could create a CA and then create certs off that CA. So all I had to do on my local machine was drop this CA in and trust that. And now every single cert that I create, whether it's mike.stokesbury.dev or usergroup.dev or anything like that. It would automatically be trusted on that piece. The one piece I did want to show, and it is 7:55. I guess the other piece that I did have to do, and we'll just walk through this blog post, which is okay to do. The other piece that I did was actually get systemd up and running. So systemd is what's actually now launching my app every single time so if I were to reboot these Pis, I don't have to go in and like manually launch my ASP.NET Core application again. The systemd script is going to sit there and actually launch my DLL. So because I do it as a self-contained, the one piece that's different for me is I don't have an exec start that actually calls .NET and then calls my DLL. It actually will, my exec start, if I were to FTP this guy up, you'll notice this guy, if I go to cd bin debug net Linux publish, if I do an ls, you'll notice I actually get a user group executable. So because this is self-contained, I'm not running the .NET executable, I'm running this user group executable that would actually kick this off. So the one difference that I've got in my stuff, and I apologize for not being able to get that far, I didn't think I was going to be talking this much, was my exec start is actually just my app and then my app without the DLL. So I can launch that directly. I don't have to call .NET because I did not want to install .NET on all my Raspberry Pis because I wanted to have control over what version I was running. So I apologize again for not getting through everything. I didn't, like I said, I was expecting this to go faster than it actually took. But any questions? Yeah, 1 minute warning. Hey, at 7:54. I'm like, wait, I still got 3 minutes. I didn't see you till just now. Any questions? Wow, no questions. So I put everyone to sleep because I was told that people are now going to use this recording to put everyone to sleep. Where did I buy my pies? So I bought most of my pies actually on Amazon. I did actually, when I went down to visit my folks live down in Southern California and they had a micro center. They've got a micro center down there that actually had a couple of pies. I ended up getting a couple more pies because they basically had them for like $15 less than what I could even get them on Amazon for. So, but Amazon was where I got, Amazon is where I got all of that hardware except for 2 of the pies. When I'm looking over at my stack, but yeah, Amazon's where I got all of this except for 2 of the pies. My router and everything. So yeah, so what you can see is this is my SSD that's connected to this Pi. This was just a power supply, right? I just needed a way to power all this stuff. So these are all, this stack is screwed together and then I just put Velcro on all this stuff. So I can actually pick this thing up. I unplug my yellow cable and I unplug this power cable and I can take this thing wherever I want to and just be up and running with a full stack.
Stokes, I'm going to jump in here and do the raffle really quick, just so we make sure.
Perfect. Please, yes, please do.
And then this is for our 1-year subscription to JetBrains. And Jack Stevens, you're the winner of our raffle. So if you'll go ahead and send me your email in the chat, we'll make sure to get that over to you.
Woohoo! Congratulations. Okay, any other questions? Besides, why didn't I actually get to any of the Pi questions that Phil had? Because I didn't talk about Pis at all in this talk.
No worries. Very cool stuff. Thanks, Stokes.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Is there a reason you picked on the Raspberry Pi 4 rather than like a 3, or is that just what was convenient?
Yeah, so 4s they had a little more RAM. From what I at least heard from my dad, and it sounds like 3s did fix it with a firmware update, but the 3s, I think, and the early 4s got really warm. But the 3s also, I think, had some issues running 64-bit. Like a lot of times when I was reading reviews on 3s, they sat there and said, stay with vertical. Sorry, Seth. I was reading Seth's question as I was, yeah, I know. I got a hard time for that from a different team already today. was reading that staying with 32-bit on the threes actually the threes performed a little better still on 32-bit than they did on 64-bit, but all the .NET Core stuff all the .NET stuff is only running on 64-bit. They don't have an ARM 32-bit version.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'm old school, Seth. That's why I still run horizontal tabs. I still run as you can see, I still run my taskbar down, or my bar down here on the side. My dad is actually more hip than I am. He's got his start menu over here on the side, like you're supposed to on these nice wide monitors and everything else. I'm still old school this way. Yeah. I just add more monitors instead of use real estate on my existing monitors correctly. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I guess we can wrap it up. How do we wrap these up usually, Kevin? It's been a while since I've attended these now.
Well, it's quite simple. We tell everyone thank you very much for coming. As a reminder, we do have the upcoming talk from both Phil and Steve. Was that next Thursday that Aaron mentioned at the beginning? So if people are interested in that, definitely go and check that out. And then we will have the next .NET user group talk same time next month.
And I'm assuming since I didn't get all this finished, I'm probably on the hook to now do a blog post on IntelliTech about what I did for pies and everything else. So I will follow up with, there will be updates to this, and I'll make sure that I get Erin to blast it out to link it not only when she posts this video when I actually get stuff up and going, but to make sure that you guys are aware so we can kind of wrap this talk up, even if it's a virtually wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will just mention too that for people who are interested, especially if you are wanting to follow up on like where are these recordings going, they will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and the link is there for those people who are interested. So that is where we are doing our best to try and make sure that these things are up in a timely manner and whatnot. And so now that I've got video proof of Stokes saying he's on the hook for blog post writing, I'm sure that will be coming along shortly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I knew that I should have done that after you push stop recording, but yeah, that's okay.
It doesn't matter what you say on video. All we have to do is tell Aaron you're going to do a blog and you're done.
No, I think Nicole right now is typing that she's actually snooping, so she's going to make sure that she keeps me honest as well. So yeah. Oh no,
yeah,
you're
right.
going to say yeah.
Perfect.